Some of the most interesting events are those that we can't initially explain. Being a rancher is a hard but rewarding job. The job becomes even more difficult when your cattle start to expire under mysterious circumstances. What many people aren't aware of is that these strange circumstances have been reported for hundreds of years, and each time these cases get investigated, we get no closer to understanding what or who is doing this. Ranchers throughout the United States have come forward with their cattle stories, but said that as of right now, even officials are confused as to why this keeps happening. Due to this worrying trend, investigators wanted to examine the animals in order to better understand what was going on, and hoped that by conducting a detailed analysis of the animals, they would be able to come to a conclusive answer. Frustratingly, the extensive surveys didn't reveal anything that would indict why the cattle were expiring in the way they were, and this led to the ranchers demanding answers and more investigations into why this was happening, saying that this phenomenon has been going on now for several months throughout Colorado and Utah. One of the investigators decided to see if there were any signs of predators in the area, but surprisingly, nothing was found, and there was very little evidence to suggest that the cows had been attacked by a predator. When researchers first conducted their studies, they found that only a few cattle had expired, but as the weeks went on, the numbers started to double, something that worried the investigators as they were out of answers and evidence for why this was happening. They suggested that perhaps the cattle were being infected with some kind of bacteria, but this theory was soon put to bed when a forensic examination of the remains revealed no evidence of this. Colorado Parks and Wildlife Manager Travis Black said the following: "Teams have found no evidence that wolves were responsible. It's perplexing. We're scratching our heads a little bit. We don't know exactly what has occurred up there. We have no evidence of wolves in that area. That doesn't mean they're not there. Sometimes wolves can be difficult to locate, but this isn't being caused by the wolves." End quote. Oddly enough, 465 miles away in Kansas, the exact same thing is happening, with ranchers wanting answers for why their cattle are expiring under mysterious circumstances. One rancher said the following: "This is happening in Kansas and it's not anything new. For me, this has been happening now for the past several years, and it makes me think that someone is targeting my cattle on purpose. If I'm being honest, it makes me think that someone wants me out, and that they are doing something to these animals that isn't easy to detect. They are not being attacked in the traditional way. There's no sign of trauma or anything on the ground that would indicate that they were in pain. Whatever is happening to them seems to be an instant hit. One minute they are grazing and acting normal, then the next morning they are on the ground. It's like a switch is being turned off inside them. I've heard about the various investigations that have taken place, and I can only speak about my personal experience, and to me it feels like us ranchers are being pushed out." End quote. According to one media outlet, they reported that the bizarre event that unfolded in Kansas happened because of strong winds. Although these reports occasionally make the news, ranchers have said that very little gets done, and that they don't know what to do. One rancher said the following: "It's hard enough making a living, but when your cattle suddenly expire under mysterious circumstances, it's not just a huge blow to your business, but it's a life that gets taken and no one is held accountable. We don't know what's causing these cattle to expire the way they do. No one has got any closer to understanding how this happens, and no evidence has been presented that provides proof as to why this keeps happening. We have no one to turn to in these matters, and each time we are being told that other animals are causing this when we know this isn't the case. This happened to my friend on his ranch. As he was driving to a separate part of his field, he drove past a small group of his cattle that were sticking close to one another. As he drove over a hill, they were no longer in his sight, but after driving back approximately an hour later, one of his cattle was on the ground, and it had a small section of its face removed. He said that his ranch is completely open, and this allows you to have a good view of everything around the property. But what confused him was that during this small time period, nothing made its way onto the property. There were no tracks left in the dirt, no animal footprints, and no spillages around the area which would help indicate which way the culprit went. He can't explain how all of this unfolded in such a short amount of time." End quote. Although the most popular stories surrounding possible advanced life forms tend to focus on the topics of people being taken during their sleep, sightings of advanced aircrafts, or supernatural occurrences featuring humanoid creatures, Many researchers who've looked into this topic often forget that some of the strongest pieces of evidence of strange happenings appears to center around the disappearances of cattle and subsequent damages to livestock. The earliest known written record of bizarre animal surgeries and sudden disappearances of a large number of livestock comes from an official document dated sometime during the early 1600s, when an investigator for the court of James I of England claimed that impossible to explain mass expirations of sheep were being recorded all across London and nearby shires. It was originally believed that the sudden expirations of the sheep could have been caused by neighbouring farms competing in market production alongside hungry travellers that were committing theft as they travelled throughout London, of which was the most heavily populated region during the 1600s. When the investigations took place, evidence was found that seemed to reject the original hypothesis. According to the court investigator, the sheep were found to have expired through causes that were otherwise impossible to attribute to human activity. Their organs, meat, and fleece remained untouched, with only evidence of possible tallow removal and blood having been completely drained from the animal with no spillage surrounding the animal. Even more difficult to explain was the sheer number of sheep that suddenly expired in what farmers believed would have been over the course of only a few hours. The investigator wrote that in some cases there were more than 100 sheep that suddenly expired, and no evidence of footprints, tracks, or spillage that could point towards a group of people having perpetrated the crime. When the investigator asked around local regions that were at the epicenter of the series of sheep disappearances and expirations, many attributed the sight of brilliant lights nearby to have been the possible cause. Some believed that the fireworks could have scared the sheep and caused them to pass away in fright, whereas others believed that the lights they had seen in the sky could have had a more sinister purpose. The court ended the investigation with the following comment. Around the City of London and some of the shires adjoining, whole expirations of sheep have been made, in some places to number 100. Nothing is taken from the sheep but their tallow and some inward parts, the whole carcasses, and fleece remaining still behind. End quote. The phenomenon would continue for several decades before ending entirely. The most interesting aspect of these sheep disappearances is that they seem to bear remarkable resemblance to modern-day cattle disappearances. When researching mass livestock expirations, it became obvious that cattle disappearances and surgeries are a fairly recent development, with the first recorded instances beginning during the 1800s. A strange finding is that the sudden change of livestock being targeted, from sheep to now cattle, appears to match directly with the world market and primary source of meat production during these times. When sheep disappearances, surgeries, and unexplained expirations were occurring, the main meat export around the world centered around sheep populations. It's only been over the last couple of centuries that the role of cattle has slowly changed for the purpose of meat consumption. During the 1600s to the late 1700s, when recorded instances of sheep expirations were occurring, cattle were predominantly used for labor and secondarily used for milk production. Eating the meat of cattle, creating leather from their hide, or using their bones for objects were only the product of cattle that had passed due to natural causes or old age. Could it be that whoever is behind these expirations switched from studying sheep from around the world to now modern-day cattle to better understand the main meat consumption diets of our entire species? The earliest known study into sudden cattle expirations began in the state of Ohio back in 1966, when an investigator known as John Keel began to look into a series of unexplainable cases that were recorded around the upper Ohio River Valley. The cattle seemed to have passed away due to bizarre circumstances that were otherwise impossible to have occurred naturally. When these cases were looked into, it revealed that a number of cattle had passed away shortly after falling from a great height, despite the fact that the pastures were wide expanses of flat, endless land, with no heights great enough to have caused the injuries recorded. Other instances noted that the cattle appeared to have been cut with precision tools that created perfectly straight lines in their thick hide, which would have required special surgical equipment. A list of consistent findings were the following. Many of the livestock expirations were made with clean surgical cuts that would have required precise tools and equipment. Many of the cattle found had been completely drained of their fluids, showed no sign of spillage in the surrounding area, or any form of clotting surrounding their wounds. Over 90% of the cattle that were targeted was between the age of 4 to 5 years old. No footprints, spillage, tracks, or evidence of any other animal nearby could be found. These discoveries and subsequent livestock investigations stayed within the farming communities for several decades, without the general public aware of the events. This was until the 1970s, when investigations began to uncover bizarre findings. The first investigation that became publicized surrounding strange animal surgeries was the famous event known as the Lady Incident, that occurred on the 9th of September back in 1967. According to the King family, Harry King, the son of Agnes King, found their 3-year-old horse named Lady. The skin surrounding the head and neck of the animal had been completely removed, with cuts that were far too precise to have been caused by a predator. There was no vital fluid at the scene, and there were absolutely no tracks of any kind surrounding the body, including Lady's horse tracks that suddenly disappeared more than 100 feet from the body, as if the animal had been running but was lifted off the ground. Oddly enough, several small holes were punched into the ground as if there were sharp poles that carried a substantial weight that had landed nearby, and 2 large bushes had been found crushed completely flat. When the story surrounding the Lady incident was published in the local paper, it was the first ever recorded livestock investigation that had been associated with a possible otherworldly encounter. Following this, investigations grew to be far more peculiar. In June of 1976, when investigating the sudden expiration of a 3-year-old cow in Rio Arriba County of New Mexico, investigators discovered what was described as a trail of suction cup-like impressions that led away from the recovered body. These impressions in the ground appeared to be in a tripod form, with each cup being roughly 4 inches in diameter, 28 inches apart, and suddenly disappeared about 500 feet away from the young cow, with no other signs of tracks surrounding the animal. Although skeptics originally believed that the incident was playing off of heightened fears of mysterious encounters, with a perpetrator appearing to have used a contraption to have created the indentations, similar incidents with suction cup-like indentations would be found all across the state following the Rio Arriba incident. 2 years later, within the same state of New Mexico, a case involving an 11-month-old bull would bring the livestock investigations a substantial piece of evidence. According to the report made on the 24th of March back in 1978, Mr. Manuel Gomez alerted the New Mexican police of his prized 11-month-old bull having been the victim of a coordinated attack. When the police investigated the body, they found consistent details matching past investigations, such as precise cuts that could have been made only with precision instruments and surgical equipment, its organs completely removed, and a lack of blood to be found anywhere on the scene. On top of these consistent reports, the police found another peculiar aspect surrounding the bull when the team began looking at the organs for signs of predators of surgical markings. According to the New Mexican police officer, Gabriel Valdez was quoted as saying the following: "Both the liver and heart were white and mushy. Both organs had the texture and consistency of peanut butter." End quote. Although the police officer could not have known at the time what the discovery entailed, today, in the medical field, we are familiar with what are referred to as ghost hearts. A ghost heart is a heart that has been completely decellularized, with all of the red blood cells and blood vessels removed from the heart, giving it a white, almost transparent, ghostly appearance. The only time a human heart is turned into a ghost heart is to prepare the heart for a donor transplant to prevent the body from rejecting the heart due to incompatible blood cells, or a reaction from the antigens of the blood from the donor's cells. In essence, this means that the blood was drained from the animal to such an extent that the organs underwent a decellularization process. Shortly after this find, the Federal Bureau of Investigation took over the investigation and sent the organs to 2 independent private research laboratories to study the samples and bring back any information surrounding their chemical composition. In the research file, the FBI document outlines the following claims. The liver was checked against a healthy food market liver, which showed a difference. The bull's liver contained no copper and 4 times the amount of phosphorus, zinc, and potassium. No explanation for this condition is available. Also, the blood which came off of the nose when it was presumably dropped was light pink in color. This blood did not clot after several days. The hide on the animal was brittle and felt to touch like parchment paper. Flesh underneath the hide was pinkish in color. A probable explanation for the pinkish blood is a control type of radiation used to expire the animal. This was according to radiation experts. The red corpuscles are destroyed, leaving the pale pinkish color. All of the toxicology findings on blood are negative because of the dissemination of the radiation. It's believed that this type of radiation is not harmful to humans, although approximately 7 people who visited the site complained of nausea and headaches. End quote. So, what do you make of these mysterious findings? Why do you think this is happening to cattle? Be sure to leave your questions and answers in the comment section below and help us to grow this community while working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.